I sat motionless as my stepmother told the judge my father's death made me a danger to my inheritance. She spoke so smoothly the room almost believed her, but I was not there to defend my sanity. I came to expose who had been faking theirs for 10 months. When the judge slowly removed his glasses and stared directly at her, my family finally realized the cold truth. This hearing was never a trap for me. My name is Aurora Rivera. I am 36 years old. I am currently sitting at the Heavy Oak defense table in the Belmere City Civil Courthouse, attending my own financial competency hearing. Underneath the table, hidden from the judge's elevated bench and the crowded gallery behind me, my hands are pressed flat against my knees. My fingers grip the dark fabric of my trousers so fiercely that my knuckles have turned completely white, the skin pulled taut over the bone. It is the only physical betrayal of the violent storm raging inside my chest. Everything above the table is utterly still, composed, and deliberately blank. I am a statue breathing slow, calculated breaths. Directly across the center aisle sits my stepmother, Diane Mercer Rivera. She has dressed for the occasion with sickening perfection. She is wearing an impeccably tailored black dress, the kind of garment that whispers of quiet, dignified mourning rather than screaming for attention. It is a brilliant, calculated choice. She is playing the role of the devoted, exhausted widow to absolute perfection, and the entire room seems to be eating from the palm of her hand. She sits with her shoulders slightly slumped, leaning forward just enough to project an aura of earnest desperation. She acts as the reluctant savior, a woman carrying a terrible burden, trying her best to rescue our legacy from a stepdaughter who has tragically and dangerously lost her mind. Diane's attorney is standing before the judge. He is a sharp-featured man wearing a suit that likely costs more than most people earn in 3 months. He employs a practiced tone of sympathetic concern, masking the brutality of his words with a veneer of professional sorrow. He is methodically, efficiently laying out the case against my sanity. He speaks of the devastating impact of my father's passing, framing my very real grief as the undeniable catalyst for a severe psychological breakdown. According to the narrative he is spinning, over the past 10 months, I have exhibited acute paranoia, harboring baseless, terrifying suspicions against my own family members. He lists accusations of erratic financial behavior, claiming I am utterly incapable of managing the Rivera family trust. He throws heavy clinical words into the quiet courtroom: delusional, incapacitated, hostile. He paints a vivid picture of a woman drowning in her own mind, thrashing wildly in the dark, and threatening to drag the entire family estate down into the depths with her. I do not look at the lawyer as he speaks. I look past his expensive suit, toward the wooden benches of the gallery, where my half-brother, Evan Rivera, is seated just 1 row behind Diane. Evan has not spoken a single word to me in 8 months. He has ignored my phone calls, left my messages on unread, returned my letters unopened, and firmly positioned himself on Diane's side of this manufactured war. Right now, his young face is a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He looks at me with a heavy mixture of deep suspicion and profound disappointment. There is a terrible sadness in his eyes, as if he is already mourning the sister he firmly believes has gone irrevocably crazy. Diane has done her insidious work well on him. She has fed him a steady daily diet of twisted truths, manipulated context, and outright lies, isolating him from me so completely that he now views his own blood as a volatile threat. The distance between us in this room is only 15 feet, but it might as well be an ocean. The primal urge to leap out of my chair, to shout the absolute truth until my throat bleeds, to grab Evan by the shoulders and violently shake him awake is almost blinding. It burns in the back of my throat, but I do not argue. I do not object. I force my jaw to remain unclenched. I force myself to remain perfectly still, regulating my breathing into slow, measured counts of 5. I am hyper-aware, observing every single detail of the theatrical performance happening around me. I watch Diane intently from the corner of my eye. Her performance is a terrifying masterclass in psychological manipulation. Her voice catches and breaks at the exact right moment whenever her lawyer mentions my father's final, agonizing days in the hospital. She reaches into her dark designer handbag and produces a crisp white tissue, dabbing the corners of her dry eyes with a rhythm so precise and calculated it could be set to a ticking metronome. The legal jargon flows around her, heavy and damning, repeated with the smooth cadence of lines from a well-rehearsed stage play. It is flawless. It is monstrous. As I sit there absorbing the orchestrated character assassination, I let my mind drift back over the grueling reality of the past 10 months. I remember exactly how I have lived since the cold morning we buried my father. It has been an existence defined by absolute, suffocating restraint. I made a solemn, unbreakable promise to myself early on. The moment I sensed the first shift in the wind, no emotional reactions, no screaming matches in the family hallway, no premature accusations that could easily be dismissed by a clever lawyer as the hysterical ramblings of a grieving daughter. I knew exactly what I was up against. I knew that the very moment I raised my voice or pointed a finger without an ironclad vault of proof, Diane would simply tilt her head, look at the authorities with pity, and say that I was unstable. So I went completely dark. I became a ghost inhabiting my own life. While Diane was busy whispering poisoned stories to our extended relatives, building a massive coalition of misplaced sympathy, and quietly locking me out of the family dynamic, I was working in the shadows. I spent hundreds of hours moving in absolute silence. I gathered every single paper receipt. I scrutinized the ink and pressure of every signature on every legal document. I tracked the timestamp and duration of every phone call. I created deeply encrypted digital backups of banking ledgers, routing numbers, and shell company registries, hiding them where she could never reach. I built an invisible, impenetrable fortress of hard evidence while intentionally allowing her to believe she was successfully tearing down my walls. I let her think she was winning. I let her think I was breaking. I bring my focus sharply back to the present moment. I can feel the immense, crushing weight of the courtroom pressing down on my shoulders. The judge is looking directly at me over the gold rim of his reading glasses, his expression unreadable. The armed bailiff by the door is watching me closely, his hand resting near his duty belt. Even the court reporter casts a fleeting, nervous glance in my direction between keystrokes. Through their collective gaze, I know exactly what I look like to them. They see a fragile woman standing on the absolute edge of a cliff, about to shatter into 1,000 unfixable pieces. They see someone crushed by the weight of grief, worn thin by sleepless nights and rampant paranoia, staring blankly into the middle distance because she has completely lost her grip on reality. And when they pivot their gaze to look at Diane, they see the anchor. They see the only rational, responsible adult left in the room. They see the strong, tragic widow valiantly trying to keep the Rivera legacy from turning to dust and blowing away. The brilliant, breathtaking cruelty of Diane's strategy finally snaps into crystal-clear focus in my mind. This elaborate legal circus was never just about stealing the money. The money was the primary objective, certainly, but the method required to secure it involved something far more sinister. Diane realized early on that the only way to get away with the massive theft was to permanently, legally discredit the one person capable of catching her. She needed to completely hijack my narrative. She needed to use the power of the state to strip me of my voice, so that when I finally stood up and shouted the truth about what she had done in the dark, the law would simply pat me on the head, dismiss me as a lunatic, and hand me a prescription bottle. She wants this court to stamp a permanent, official seal of approval on her lie. She is trying to turn her brazen theft into a noble rescue mission, and my horrifying truth into a documented medical delusion. The vast courtroom falls into a heavy, expectant silence. The attorney has finally finished his opening remarks, taking his seat with a look of grim satisfaction. Diane lowers her head, clutching her crumpled tissue against her chest. The judge shuffles the thick stack of papers on his elevated desk. His expression remains carefully neutral, but his shoulders seem heavily burdened by the ugly, intimate family dispute laid out before him. He folds his hands together and looks directly down at me. His voice cuts through the quiet, stagnant air, formal, echoing, and dripping with authoritative power. He asks if I understand the severe nature of the accusations being levied against my mental competency. He asks if I have anything to say in response to the petition before the court proceeds to hear the expert medical testimony designed to lock me away from my own life. I slowly release my death grip on my knees. The warm blood rushes back into my pale fingertips, a sharp, tingling sensation that fiercely grounds me in the physical world. I push my chair back. I stand up to my full height. I smooth the front of my gray suit jacket with deliberate care. I do not look at Diane, though I can feel her eyes burning into the side of my face. I do not look at Evan, whose heart I am about to break all over again. I look only at the judge. The tension in the wide room is so thick and heavy, it threatens to suffocate everyone breathing it, but my lungs feel perfectly clear. I have waited almost an entire year for this exact fraction of a second. When I finally speak, my voice does not waver. It does not tremble with unshed tears. It is not overly loud, but it is sharp, even, and chillingly calm, carrying effortlessly to every corner of the room. Yes, Your Honor. I do have a response, I say, letting the quiet words hang in the heavy air for a brief, agonizing heartbeat. But if this court truly wants to understand the story being told in this room today, we cannot start with my behavior over the past 10 months. We have to go back to before my father died. My father, Daniel Rivera, was not born into boardrooms or luxury. He was a man who built his entire life from the dirt up. He started his career in commercial infrastructure construction, spending his early 20s wearing heavy work boots and breathing in the dust of rising cityscapes. Through sheer force of will, countless sleepless nights, and an intellect that could read a city grid like a chessboard, he eventually founded his own private real estate development consulting firm. He named it Rivera Urban Transit Group. Under his leadership, the company grew into a formidable force in the industry. He was a pillar of stability, a man who believed that a solid foundation was the only thing that mattered, whether you were building a skyscraper or a family. But our family foundation cracked early. My biological mother passed away from a relentless, wasting chronic illness when I was still young. Her death stripped the warmth from our home. For years, the house felt entirely too large, echoing with a quiet, heavy grief that my father and I did not know how to articulate. We lived together in a state of silent survival, surrounded by empty rooms and the fading scent of her perfume. Then, many years later, Diane appeared. She did not force her way into our lives. She slipped in with the gentle, unassuming grace of a woman who knew exactly how to make herself indispensable. She was incredibly tactful, possessing an innate talent for organizing chaos and making a house feel alive again. She brought a new rhythm to our cold hallways. In those early years, she played the role of the flawless, dedicated wife with absolute perfection. She was the woman who memorized the exact timing of my father's daily vitamins. She orchestrated elaborate, warm birthday dinners that made him smile. She always knew the perfect, tasteful gift to present to his business partners. To the outside world, and for a long time to me, she appeared to be the miraculous force holding our recovering family together, preventing us from breaking apart. By the time Diane firmly established her reign over the household, I had already grown up and moved out. I lived in an apartment across the city, consumed by my own demanding career. I worked for a highly specialized private financial investigation firm named Halcyon Ledger Advisory. My daily reality was a grueling dive into the darkest corners of corporate finance. I spent my days tracing commercial fraud, tearing apart falsified tax returns, and hunting down hidden cash flows buried beneath dozens of corporate veils. My job was to find the lies that wealthy people tried to hide in their ledgers. I was trained to suspect everyone and trust nothing but the absolute math. It is a bitter irony that my expertise in uncovering deception became the very weapon Diane used to isolate me. She recognized my physical and professional distance and carefully manipulated it. She never shouted, and she never insulted me to my face. Her method was a slow, dripping poison. She would offer soft, sympathetic sighs to our relatives, casually mentioning that I was a child who only knew how to work. She painted me as cold and fiercely analytical, suggesting I was fundamentally incapable of understanding my father's emotional needs. She subtly planted the idea that I was never around when he felt his weakest, prioritizing my investigations over my own flesh and blood. While I was busy untangling foreign bank accounts, my younger half-brother Evan was living much closer to the family estate. Evan was highly susceptible to the environment Diane cultivated. He was constantly bathed in her carefully constructed version of reality, every single day. She fed him a steady diet of stories highlighting my supposed callousness. If I missed a Sunday dinner because of a massive fraud case, Diane would look at Evan with mournful eyes and say it was a shame I did not value family time. Evan absorbed every word. He began to view my demanding career not as an achievement, but as an active abandonment of our family. The true shift in our family dynamic began when my father started to lose his physical strength. He suffered 2 severe, consecutive hospitalizations within a span of 6 months. The doctors managed to stabilize him, and his mind remained as sharp and brilliant as it had always been, but his body was completely exhausted. The vibrant, imposing titan of industry was suddenly struggling to walk up the stairs without losing his breath. To cope with his profound fatigue, he gradually started handing over the mundane, daily household paperwork to Diane. It was a logical decision for a tired man. He wanted to clear his mind of utility bills, minor investment portfolio updates, and the general administrative clutter of running a large estate. I hated watching this transition happen. Every instinct I had honed at Halcyon Ledger Advisory screamed that surrendering financial visibility was a dangerous mistake. You never hand over the keys to the ledger without oversight. But I was trapped. I had absolutely no justifiable, concrete reason to object. On the surface, Diane was merely being a devoted, loving wife trying to ease the heavy burden of her ailing husband. She had never done a single tangible thing that crossed the line into verifiable misconduct. If I had spoken up, if I had demanded to audit the household accounts, I would have perfectly validated the exact narrative she was already spinning. I would have looked exactly like the paranoid, heartless daughter who cared more about control than her father's comfort. So, I forced myself to remain silent, swallowing my professional unease. The breaking point, the moment the invisible veil finally tore, arrived late in November. It was the last Thanksgiving we would ever spend with my father alive. The dining room of the estate was incredibly warm, filled with the rich scent of roasted turkey and the comforting hum of holiday conversation. After dinner, while the rest of the family was in the living room, I sat next to my father on the quiet sun porch. He looked frail, wrapped in a thick wool sweater, but he was smiling. We were making idle conversation when he suddenly leaned over and asked me a highly specific question about a trust account yield. It was an account he had personally structured 15 years ago to manage a small sector of municipal bonds. I froze. My father knew the mechanics of that specific account better than he knew the lines on his own hands. But the way he phrased the question was fundamentally wrong. The baseline numbers he casually referenced were entirely inaccurate, off by hundreds of thousands of dollars. He spoke with a mild, trusting confusion, completely unaware that the premises of his question were entirely fabricated. He sounded exactly like a man who had recently had his own finances explained to him by someone who was actively lying. In that exact fraction of a second, the comforting warmth of the holiday room vanished completely. The cheerful noise from the living room faded into a dull, terrifying ringing in my ears. I looked through the glass doors and saw Diane pouring coffee for Evan, smiling her perfect, gentle smile. That was the moment the truth locked into place. Someone in this house was not merely taking care of a dying man. Someone was actively, quietly rewriting the very reality he lived in. She was feeding him a distorted version of his own life, building a brand new, fraudulent financial world right beneath his feet, while he was simply too tired to look down. From that cold Thanksgiving evening onward, I stopped being a daughter visiting her father. I became an investigator walking a crime scene. The reading of the final testament took place in the sterile, heavily air-conditioned conference room of my father's estate attorney. It was exactly 7 days after we stood in the freezing rain and watched his casket lower into the ground. The air in the room was thick and uncomfortable, carrying the distinct, heavy silence that always precedes the division of a lifetime of labor. The attorney, a man with tired eyes and a perfectly pressed gray suit, sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He methodically broke the seal on the thick envelope and began to read the terms that would dictate the remainder of our lives. My father was a generous man, but he was also a builder. He understood structural integrity better than anyone, and he knew exactly where the load-bearing walls of his empire needed to be placed. The attorney announced that the core assets of the family trust, along with the absolute, unquestionable oversight of the investment portfolio, would be placed entirely under my control as the primary managing trustee. Diane was not left destitute, far from it. She was guaranteed lifelong residence in the sprawling family estate, a generous monthly allowance designed to comfortably maintain her current standard of living for decades, and a massive, immediate separate cash distribution. I watched her face when the attorney spoke those critical words. She kept her posture perfectly aligned. She held a damp tissue loosely in her left hand, maintaining the soft, tragic aura of a grieving widow. But the eyes always betray the lie. For a fraction of a second, the sorrow completely evaporated from her gaze, replaced by a flash of absolute glacial fury. The muscles in her jaw tightened so sharply, I thought I might hear her teeth crack. It was not the profound sadness of a woman missing her husband. It was the sharp, violent anger of a woman realizing she had just been denied the master keys to the vault. She was wealthy, but she was not in control, and for a predator, lacking control is worse than starving. Exactly 3 weeks after the funeral, the whispers began. They did not start as direct accusations. Diane was far too intelligent for a frontal assault. Instead, she weaponized her manufactured concern. She started making quiet, solemn phone calls to our extended relatives, the board members, and my father's oldest friends. She would lower her voice to a sympathetic hush and tell them that I was simply not doing well. She planted the seeds that my grief had mutated into something dark and unmanageable. She claimed I was sleeping less than 3 hours a night, that I was treating everyone in the family like a hostile suspect, and that I was on the verge of making catastrophic, confusing financial decisions regarding the company. I heard the echoes of her campaign almost immediately. Cousins would call me with overly gentle tones, asking if I was taking care of my mental health. Former business partners would send cautious emails, politely suggesting I take a few months off to process my trauma. I knew exactly what she was building. She was constructing a quarantine zone around me, ensuring that if I ever raised an alarm, nobody would take my warning seriously. While she was busy painting me as a fragile, paranoid mess, I locked the heavy deadbolt of my apartment door, closed the thick blackout curtains, and went to work. I sat at my dining table, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of my laptop screen, and began a surgical, microscopic review of the Rivera Urban Transit Group ledgers. I did not look at the massive, multi-million-dollar contracts. I knew Diane would never be foolish enough to siphon money where the glaring lights of annual audits would immediately catch her. I looked in the dark corners. I looked at the administrative outflow, the miscellaneous consulting fees, the petty cash replenishments, and the vendor retainers. It took me 4 consecutive nights of burning through digital spreadsheets to spot the blood trail. It was a masterpiece of financial camouflage. I found a distinct pattern of small, rhythmic disbursements bleeding out of the operational funds. The payments were all carefully structured just below the standard threshold that would trigger an automatic internal review. There were hundreds of recurring transfers for amounts like $8,500 or $9,850. To a casual observer or a tired accountant simply matching totals, they looked like standard, unremarkable operational expenses. But to a forensic investigator, a deliberate pattern of structuring is as obvious as a loud siren. I isolated the outgoing transfers and followed the money. The funds were flowing outward to three entirely unfamiliar corporate entities. Their names were perfectly bland, designed to sound completely legitimate and boring: North Creek Civic Partners, Vail Harbor Holdings, and Lattice Grant Solutions. I pulled the public registration records for all three entities. The cold reality of the theft began to solidify in my hands. All three companies were empty shells. They had been hurriedly incorporated in the exact same state, registered by the exact same anonymous registered agent, within the incredibly narrow window of 2 months right before my father died. I dug deeper, utilizing the proprietary investigative databases I had access to through my firm. I searched for anything that would justify their existence. There were no real, signed consulting contracts on file. There were no documented acceptance protocols for services rendered. There were no listed employees, no payroll taxes, and no physical operating addresses other than a single shared post office box in a strip mall 3 states away. The only things these companies produced were beautifully formatted, legally flawless invoices, billing my father's firm for vague services, like strategic urban analysis and logistical compliance consulting. But tracing a shell company is only half the battle. The true objective is finding the person holding the bucket at the end of the pipeline. I spent another 48 hours meticulously tracking the routing numbers, bypassing the immediate destination banks and pulling the secondary transfer logs. The money from North Creek, Vail Harbor, and Lattice did not stay in their respective accounts. Within 24 hours of receiving a payment from my father's company, the funds were swept out and consolidated. They all flowed directly into a single, private, high-yield investment account. When my secure terminal finally unmasked the primary account holders of that final destination, all the air abruptly left my lungs. The room started to spin. I had to grip the edges of my wooden dining table to keep myself anchored. The joint account was registered under 2 names. The first name was Diane Mercer Rivera. The second name was Russell Dane. I stared at the glowing letters until they burned into my retinas. I knew exactly who Russell Dane was. He was the owner of a mid-sized commercial renovation company. My father had hired him a few years ago to handle the remodeling of several minor lobby spaces in our downtown properties. He was a man who used to drink coffee in our kitchen, a man who shook my father's hand and asked about his health. The sickening rush of adrenaline in my veins was not just about the money anymore. It was not even about the sheer audacity of the infidelity. The true mind-altering horror was the timeline. This financial infrastructure, these shell companies, the joint investment account, it had all been established while my father was still breathing. It was built while he was lying in a sterile hospital bed, hooked up to intravenous lines, fighting for every single breath. While he was blindly trusting his wife to manage the household and protect his legacy, she was actively partnering with another man to drain his life's work. They were building their future retirement fund using the money my father bled for, right while they waited for his heart to finally stop beating. The immediate, blinding urge was to burn the entire world down. I wanted to print the ledgers, drive straight to the family estate, kick the front door open, and throw the undeniable proof directly into Diane's face. I wanted to scream the truth to Evan, to the board of directors, to every single person who had bought into her saintly widow routine. I wanted to ruin her immediately. But my professional training brutally overpowered my raw grief. I stopped my hand before I could even reach for my car keys. I took a deep, shuddering breath and forced myself to look at the board objectively. If I struck right now, I would lose everything. If I suddenly burst out of my apartment shouting about a secret affair and waving a stack of complicated, unauthorized bank traces, I would be playing exactly the role she had cast for me. Diane would simply look at the chaotic papers, look at my exhausted, furious face, and she would gently tell everyone that the pressure had finally broken my mind. She would claim the documents were fabricated, a desperate, sad delusion concocted by a grieving stepdaughter who hated her. The board would recoil, the family would pity me, the police would tell me it was a civil matter, and Diane would quietly accelerate the theft, hiding the remaining assets before anyone could legally compel her to stop. She wanted a reaction. She needed me to strike early, wildly, and without legal authority. So, I made the hardest, most excruciating decision of my entire life. I decided to completely suppress every single human instinct screaming inside of me. I closed the laptop. I deleted my search history. I gathered the printed documents and locked them inside a fireproof safe hidden in the back of my closet. I chose absolute, suffocating silence. If Diane wanted everyone to believe that her smear campaign was working, if she wanted them to think I was a broken, useless, retreating shadow of a woman, I was going to give her exactly what she wanted. I was going to let her feel incredibly safe. I would play dead, entirely, until the very moment she stepped directly into the trap she thought she was setting for me. Diane shifted the battlefield from the quiet corners of country club dining rooms directly into the sanctity of my brother's home. She escalated the game with terrifying precision. The hushed whispers were no longer enough. She needed to manufacture an active crisis. She began calling Evan in the dead of night. I only knew this because Evan, completely manipulated and genuinely terrified for our family legacy, would leave me frantic voice messages the following day. He told me Diane was calling him at 2 or 3 in the morning, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated anxiety. She fed him stories of catastrophic professional failures on my part. She claimed I had forgotten to authorize crucial vendor payments, that I was completely ignoring urgent emails from our tax attorneys, and that I had missed high-stakes board meetings without a single word of explanation. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a company teetering on the absolute edge of a federal audit because the woman at the helm had entirely lost her grip on reality. The true evil genius of her strategy lay in the evidence she provided him. Diane did not just expect Evan to take her word for it. She supplied him with a carefully curated alternate reality. She forwarded him email chains where my responses were deliberately sliced in half. A perfectly rational, forceful demand for clearer accounting would be cut down to look like a confused, paranoid rant. She showed him printed screenshots of text messages with the opening context completely cropped out, leaving only my frustrated replies hanging in a void. She would intentionally change the schedule of a crucial conference call from 10 in the morning to 11, purposely fail to notify me, and then document my absence as undeniable proof of my rapidly deteriorating cognitive function. She was meticulously sculpting a highly specific, legally damning portrait of me. She wanted Evan, and eventually the outside world, to see a woman so fundamentally shattered by the trauma of losing her father that her nervous system had simply collapsed. She was building a case that I was utterly incapable of managing a simple personal checking account, let alone steering a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate portfolio. My first, burning instinct was to fight back with everything I possessed. I wanted to storm into Evan's house, throw the unedited server logs onto his coffee table, and shake him until he saw the truth. I wanted to call every single family member and expose her meticulous lies. But my years of investigating corporate psychopaths had taught me one vital, unforgiving lesson. A desperate, defensive target looks exactly like a guilty or unstable target. If I reacted with fury and wild accusations, I would give her exactly the reaction she was trying to provoke. So, I chose a different path. I embraced the pathetic role she had written for me. I began to actively, physically play the weak, broken victim she desperately needed me to be. It was the most exhausting performance of my entire life. When I was forced to attend mandatory family gatherings, I made sure I looked the part. I slept poorly on purpose to ensure the dark circles under my eyes were genuine. I wore wrinkled blouses. I let my shoulders slump forward, carrying the physical posture of a defeated woman. I spoke in soft, hesitant tones, letting my sentences trail off without finishing them. I actively avoided any direct eye contact and entirely refused to engage in any conflict. During one particularly tense Sunday dinner, the psychological warfare reached a boiling point. Diane subtly challenged a minor financial decision I had made regarding routine property maintenance, presenting a flawed argument designed to make me look incompetent in front of our visiting cousins. Normally, I would have deployed my usual arsenal of facts, figures, and contract clauses to dismantle her argument in seconds. Instead, I forced my heart rate to slow down. I looked at her. then looked down at my plate. I simply stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. I shook my head, rubbed my temples as if fighting a massive migraine, and quietly excused myself from the dining room without defending my position at all. As I walked down the long hallway, I could feel her triumphant gaze burning into my back. I gave her the absolute, intoxicating satisfaction of watching me surrender. I let her believe, down to the marrow of her bones, that my spirit was completely broken and that she had already won the psychological war, but the truth was entirely different. While I was projecting utter defeat in the daylight, my nights were consumed by a relentless, cold-blooded digital excavation inside the locked, silent walls of my apartment. I was not falling apart. I was building a guillotine. I established a multi-tiered, deeply encrypted evidence storage system that would survive any legal subpoena she might try to throw at me. I routed every single piece of data through off-site servers located in different global time zones. I took physical photographs of hardware access screens. I downloaded massive, raw server logs that documented exactly who was logging into the company portal, from what internet protocol address, and at what specific hour of the night. Most importantly, I used specialized forensic software to crack open the hidden layers of the documents she was forging. I extracted the invisible metadata buried deep inside standard portable document formats and scanned signature files. That metadata was the smoking gun. It told the true, undeniable story, revealing the exact dates and times those documents were originally created, when they were modified, and the specific user accounts that saved them. The data proved, beyond a shadow of a legal doubt, that her critical authorizations were generated weeks after the dates stamped on their faces, and long after my father had lost the physical ability to hold a pen. I knew my own expert analysis, no matter how thorough, would not be enough for a skeptical judge. It would be framed as a biased attack by a bitter stepdaughter. I needed unimpeachable, third-party verification, working entirely off the grid, communicating only through secure, encrypted messaging protocols on a prepaid burner phone. I quietly hired 2 elite specialists. The first was a highly sought-after forensic document examiner. The second was an independent digital forensic analyst who usually worked on federal cybercrime cases. Neither of them had any public or professional connection to me, to Halcyon Ledger Advisory, or to my family. I paid their exorbitant retainer fees using a detached private bank account I had maintained since my college days, an account Diane did not even know existed. I needed absolute ghosts. I needed professionals whom Diane could never trace, bribe, intimidate, or discredit. They began processing the massive data packets I sent them, slowly and meticulously building an ironclad fortress of empirical evidence. Then, the fatal blow finally landed. It did not come in the form of another vicious rumor or a doctored email chain. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening, delivered by a tired process server who knocked heavily on my apartment door. He handed me a thick, yellow manila envelope. Inside was a formal legal petition filed with the city civil court. Diane had officially filed for emergency temporary financial guardianship. I stood alone in my narrow hallway, reading the thick legal document as the sound of the rain pounded against my windows. I felt the blood turn to absolute ice in my veins. The legal language was clinical, precise, and entirely devastating. She was formally, legally accusing me of displaying severe signs of mental instability and cognitive decline following the traumatic death of my father. She was aggressively petitioning the court to step in and strip me of all my legal rights to access, manage, or oversee any aspect of the Rivera family trust. Staring at the raised, official seal of the court stamped on the first page, a terrifying, crystalline realization washed over me. The scale of her ambition was breathtaking. This was never just a simple smash-and-grab robbery. Diane did not just want to steal the money and run. She wanted the American legal system to officially, permanently brand me as an incompetent lunatic. She understood the endgame better than I had ever given her credit for. She knew that if I eventually found the missing funds and brought the hard evidence to the authorities, it would be her word as the grieving widow against my word as the disgruntled stepdaughter. But if she won this guardianship hearing, my word would legally cease to exist. If a judge declared me mentally unfit, every single true thing I said about her bizarre financial transactions, her fraudulent shell companies, and her secret lover would be instantly dismissed. The police, the board of directors, and my own brother would look at my mountain of evidence and simply see the tragic, paranoid delusions of a profoundly sick woman. She was trying to legally weaponize my own grief to bury the truth in a padded cell forever. I walked slowly into my dark living room and dropped the heavy legal petition onto my desk. I opened my laptop, but I did not type in my password. I just sat in the dark and stared at the black, glossy screen. The monitor acted as a dark mirror, reflecting the pale, exhausted lines of my face. The woman staring back at me looked exactly like someone who had been pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance. But behind those tired, dark eyes, there was a cold, unyielding fire that Diane could not see. I knew exactly what I had to do next. My initial urge was to fight the petition immediately, to file an aggressive counter-motion and try to have the case dismissed in the preliminary stages. But doing so would require me to show her my hand. It would warn her that I was fully prepared, lucid, and armed with forensic experts. I could not afford to scare her away now. I had to let her commit completely to her own lie. I slowly pushed the lid of the laptop down. The quiet click echoed loudly in the empty, silent room. Sitting there in the dark, I made my final, terrifying decision. I would not hire an aggressive defense team to stop Diane from walking into that courthouse. I would not block the legal door she was trying to force open. Instead, I would hold that door wide open for her. I would let her walk right in. I would let her walk so deeply into the trap of her own arrogant making that when the jaws finally snapped shut, she would never be able to find her way back out. The psychological warfare escalated into a formal legal onslaught when her legal team introduced their hired gun. They retained a forensic consulting psychiatrist named Dr. Alan Wexler. He was the kind of expert witness who made a very lucrative living telling courts exactly what the paying party wanted to hear. The most astounding fact was that Dr. Wexler had never once sat in a room with me. He had never evaluated my cognitive state, never asked me a single question about my grief, and never reviewed my actual medical history. Instead, he built an entirely damning psychological profile based solely on a carefully curated package of garbage provided by my stepmother. She handed him a few disjointed voicemails where I sounded exhausted, alongside several heavily redacted email chains where my professional frustration was framed as irrational anger. From those pathetic scraps, Dr. Wexler authored a devastating formal evaluation. He weaponized clinical terminology to destroy my credibility. His report stated that I exhibited severe signs of obsessive control and persecutory delusions. He claimed that I was experiencing a complete executive behavioral collapse under the crushing pressure of personal loss. It was a terrifyingly effective piece of fiction. It took every sharp, analytical trait that made me excellent at my job and twisted them into symptoms of a profound mental breakdown. To any judge reading that report without knowing the truth, I looked like a textbook case of a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality, but the psychiatric evaluation was merely the opening salvo. Her lawyer filed an accompanying exhibit that was infinitely more dangerous. It was labeled as an internal memorandum. When my own counsel handed me the copy across a conference table, my heart physically slammed against my ribs. The document was typed on my father's official company letterhead and bore his signature at the bottom. The content was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation and legal maneuvering. The text gently but firmly stated that my father recognized the immense pressure his business put on me. It decreed that if I ever showed signs of severe emotional instability, or if the burden of the family trust compromised my well-being, his wife was granted the immediate, overriding authority to step in and manage the operational funds. If a judge merely glanced at that piece of paper, the entire case would instantly swing in her favor. It was perfectly designed to look both logical and deeply affectionate. It painted my father as a tragic, wise figure who had accurately predicted his daughter's inevitable mental collapse and tried to protect the family from beyond the grave. I sat in my office staring at that piece of paper for 3 straight hours. The panic initially clouded my vision, but then my professional training sliced through the fear. I looked closely at the signature. I knew the way my father signed his name. He always used a heavy, dark ink pen. He pressed down hard when he wrote, leaving a distinct physical indentation on the paper. The ink would always pool slightly darker at the end of the final stroke. But the signature on this memorandum was entirely wrong. It was far too clean. It was completely flat against the white background. There was no texture, no varied pressure, no soul to the strokes. It looked exactly like a high-quality digital image placed neatly onto a blank surface. I securely transmitted the scanned file to the independent forensic document examiner I had hired weeks prior. I demanded a rush analysis. The results arrived in my encrypted inbox exactly 48 hours later, confirming my darkest suspicions. The signature was an absolute forgery. It had been digitally lifted from an old municipal permit application my father had signed 4 years ago. The expert proved that the pixels had been meticulously superimposed onto the new fraudulent document. But the forensic digital analyst uncovered something far more sinister. By extracting the deeply buried metadata from the electronic source file, we found the exact creation timestamp. The document granting her emergency control was not written while my father was alive. The digital file was created on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 17 days after my father passed away. Every instinct screamed at me to file an immediate emergency injunction. Standard legal practice dictated that I should expose the forgery right then and there, aggressively moving to strike the document and have her attorney sanctioned for submitting fabricated evidence, but I forced myself to stop. I realized that if I played my hand too early, I would only prove her point. I would look frantic and combative. More importantly, she might withdraw the petition, claim ignorance about the forgery, and find a different way to steal the estate. I made the cold, calculated decision to do absolutely nothing. I instructed my lawyer to offer only the weakest, most disorganized pushback during the preliminary discovery phase. I allowed her entire fabricated file, including the forged memorandum and the bogus psychiatric report, to be entered into the official court record completely unchallenged. I let her legal team believe that I was too paralyzed by grief and panic to mount a coherent defense. I wanted her to feel invincible. I needed her to confidently lock herself inside a perjury trap so deep she could never dig her way out. While she was busy celebrating her impending victory, I accelerated my quiet investigation into the financial theft. Proving the money went to shell companies was a solid start, but I needed to physically tie her and Russell Dane to the crime at the exact same moment. I reached out to a former colleague who now worked in private banking compliance. It took immense persuasion and calling in every favor I had, but I eventually secured a set of printed still images taken from a security camera at a boutique wealth management branch. The timestamps on the grainy photographs perfectly aligned with the exact dates the fraudulent shell companies were incorporated. The images clearly showed my stepmother and Russell walking into the bank lobby together. They were captured, sitting side by side at a private banker's desk, reviewing paperwork and signing the documents required to open the joint investment account that was currently swallowing my father's legacy. The money trail did not simply end in that investment account. I spent another week tracking the outbound wire transfers. The funds were being washed and sent to a property management firm located 2 states away. I managed to acquire a copy of a residential lease agreement for a massive, high-altitude luxury apartment. The lease was signed exclusively by Russell. However, the automated monthly rent payments, totaling $12,000 a month, were being drawn directly from an account entirely funded by the stolen corporate money. She was not just stealing to get rich. She was actively financing a lavish, secret new life with her accomplice using the very empire my father bled to build. I did not just toss all this explosive evidence into a messy pile. I spent days meticulously structuring the destruction of her life. I built a massive, physical binder, dividing the undeniable proof into distinct, color-coded sections. The red section contained the bank routing numbers, the shell company registrations, and the luxury apartment lease. The blue section held the digital forensic reports, the metadata extraction logs, and the proof of the forged signature. The green section laid out the chronological timeline, proving exactly when the affair started and when the theft began. I layered the evidence so tightly that no lawyer in the country could pull it apart. My ultimate goal had shifted. I was no longer just trying to prove she stole money. I was building an inescapable legal narrative to prove that her entire campaign to declare me mentally unstable was not a tragic family misunderstanding. The smear campaign was a deliberate, premeditated, and essential mechanism of a massive federal fraud scheme. She had to make me look crazy so no one would look at the math. I closed the heavy binder late on a Sunday night, knowing that when I finally opened it in court, the explosion would be catastrophic. 2 days before the scheduled hearing, the psychological isolation Diane had carefully constructed finally reached my front door. Evan arrived at my apartment completely unannounced. He did not text or call first. He just stood in the hallway, his shoulders hunched, looking entirely drained of life. When I opened the door, he refused to step inside. He remained on the threshold, staring at me with a look of profound, agonizing pity that made my stomach physically turn. "Are you doing this to yourself?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of his own exhaustion. "Are you just obsessed to the point of self-destruction?" That single question cut deeper and inflicted more damage than any legal document Diane had ever filed against me. It was the ultimate, heartbreaking proof of her absolute victory on the most dangerous battlefield of all. She had not merely stolen our family assets. She had successfully terraformed my own brother's perception of reality. She had manipulated him so completely that he genuinely believed my search for the truth was actually a glaring symptom of a terminal mental disease. He was looking at his older sister and seeing a dangerous stranger. My hand tightened around the edge of the doorframe. The massive fireproof safe containing the meticulously organized, color-coded evidence binders was sitting in my bedroom closet, barely 30 feet away. All I had to do was grab his arm, pull him inside, spin the combination lock, and show him the shell company registrations, the forged signature metadata, and the luxury apartment lease. I could cure his manipulated pain and clear my name in exactly 5 minutes, but I knew the unforgiving rules of the psychological war Diane was playing. If I brought Evan into the fold right now, before the evidence was officially entered into the court record under oath, Diane would immediately spin it against me. She would undoubtedly call his phone within the hour, hear the sudden shift in his tone, and instantly file an emergency police report, claiming I was aggressively manipulating my vulnerable younger brother to support my paranoid delusions. She would accuse me of holding him emotionally hostage, further cementing her narrative that I was a danger to the family. I could not risk giving her that highly explosive ammunition. So, I forced my hand to stay glued to the doorframe. I swallowed the bitter, acidic taste of complete isolation. I looked straight into my brother's terrified eyes and offered him nothing but a cryptic, emotionally detached directive. "When we get into that courtroom on Tuesday," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of any defensive emotion, "do not look at my face. Just look at the papers." I closed the door before he could say another word. Leaning my forehead against the cool, solid wood as the sound of his footsteps slowly faded down the carpeted hallway. The night before the hearing, I sat entirely alone on the floor of my living room. All the lights were turned off. The only illumination came from the amber glow of the street lamps bleeding through the window blinds. I was no longer reviewing my legal strategy or memorizing statutory codes. The trap was already set, the hinges oiled and waiting. Instead, I found myself opening the locked audio vault on my secure mobile device. I began playing the saved voicemails my father had left me during the final 8 months of his life. I sat in the dark and just listened to his breathing. I listened to the subtle, tragic degradation of his vocal cords as the months progressed. And then, buried deep within a seemingly mundane message recorded on a Thursday afternoon 4 months before he died, I heard a specific sentence I had completely brushed past when I first received it. "Hey, kiddo." His gruff voice crackled softly through the small speaker. "Just calling to check in. Diane sure likes to handle a bit too much for me lately. I think she's just worried, but I need to get back to the office soon to look at the ledgers." My breath caught sharply in my throat. I immediately reached for my laptop, booting it up and bypassing the complex security protocols on his archived corporate email server. I dug past the sent folders and the primary inbox, diving straight into the automated backup files of his deleted drafts. I was hunting for any digital footprint matching the timeline of that specific voicemail. It took me nearly 3 hours of relentless searching, but I finally found it. It was a highly fragmented, unsent email addressed directly to his primary corporate attorney. It contained only 2 distinct sentences. It read that he needed to immediately adjust the trust access protocols following the corporate restructuring we executed early in the year. It explicitly stated his desire to require immediate dual authorization for any operational fund transfers exceeding $10,000. He never finished typing the document. He never pressed the send button. This discovery was not a standalone piece of legal evidence. It would never hold up in a court of law against the forged memorandum Diane had expertly produced. But for me, sitting in the absolute silence of my dark apartment, it was a massive, heart-shattering revelation. My father had known. His legendary, razor-sharp business instincts had not completely failed him at the end. He had felt the unnatural, creeping shift in the household dynamics. He had sensed Diane aggressively overstepping her boundaries, and he had actively tried to build a financial firewall to stop her from bleeding his company dry. But his physical body had simply run out of time. He was far too weak to finish building the armor. The profound pain that washed over me in that moment was entirely different from the burning anger of being robbed. It was the devastating, crushing guilt of terrible timing. My father had desperately tried to take a step back from the woman poisoning his life, but he could not move fast enough to escape her reach. And I, the specialized investigator who made a highly lucrative living hunting corporate liars, had arrived at the undeniable truth months too late to save him while he was still breathing. That devastating realization hardened the cold fire inside my chest into something absolute, heavy, and unbreakable. When the sun finally rose on the morning of the hearing, I did not feel exhausted. I felt surgically precise. I walked deliberately to my closet and pulled out a simple, dark gray suit. It was the most severe, structured piece of clothing I owned. I did not wear a single piece of jewelry. I applied absolutely no color to my lips or cheeks. I pulled my hair back into a tight, unforgiving knot at the base of my neck. Diane was preparing to walk into that courtroom dressed as the fragile, tragic, weeping victim. I needed to present the exact opposite visual narrative to the judge. I wanted to look exactly like the cold, undeniable truth. The truth does not put on a theatrical performance. The truth does not weep or beg for misplaced sympathy. The truth does not shatter into pieces under immense pressure. It simply stands there, unmoving and silent, and waits patiently for the lies to crash against it and break. I packed the meticulously organized, color-coded evidence binders into a heavy, reinforced leather briefcase. The sheer volume of the compressed paper made the bag incredibly dense. It weighed well over 20 pounds. I carried it out to my car and drove across the city to the Belmere Civil Courthouse in complete, unbroken silence, leaving the radio completely off to preserve my focus. When I finally pushed my weight against the heavy wooden double doors and entered the courtroom, the atmospheric pressure in the room immediately shifted. Diane was already seated comfortably at the plaintiff table, wearing her elegant, tailored black dress, whispering softly and confidently to her expensive attorney. Evan was sitting in the gallery directly behind her, staring rigidly at the floorboards. I walked straight down the center aisle. My low heels clicked against the polished hardwood floor with a steady, rhythmic, and unhurried cadence. I reached the defense table, placed my briefcase on the wood, and unlatched the heavy brass locks. I reached inside and pulled out the massive, consolidated evidence binder. I stepped forward and handed it across the wooden partition to the court clerk, requesting it be officially logged into the preliminary record. The binder was so incredibly thick and heavy that the veteran clerk actually fumbled for a second. She had to drop her pen on the desk and use both of her hands to brace the massive weight of the paper against her chest. The loud, heavy thud of the binder hitting the clerk's desk echoed sharply through the quiet. tense room, at that exact sound, Diane immediately stopped whispering. She slowly turned her head and stared directly at the massive stack of paper resting on the desk. For the very first time since the day my father died, the flawless mask of the confident, sorrowful widow slipped. Just for a fraction of a second, I saw a sharp, involuntary twitch in the corner of her left eye. I saw the terrifying, icy realization flash across her face that she might not be the only woman in the room who had spent the last 10 months preparing for an absolute war. The gavel struck the heavy wooden block, and the hearing officially commenced. Diane took the witness stand first. She swore an oath on a Bible with a practiced, trembling hand. For the next hour, she delivered an absolute masterclass in emotional theater. She did not raise her voice. She spoke in the hushed, exhausted tones of a woman who had given everything she possessed to a dying man. She detailed the agonizing daily routine of my father's final months. She talked about organizing his complicated medication schedule at 6 in the morning, driving him to endless oncology appointments at 2 in the afternoon, and sitting awake by his bedside through the darkest hours of the night. She wove a narrative that painted her as the absolute emotional and physical anchor of our family. Then, she carefully contrasted her profound devotion with my cold presence. She described me sweeping into the house on random Sunday evenings, carrying nothing but thick leather binders full of spreadsheets. She told the judge I rarely asked how my father felt, focusing only on what the latest quarterly financial projections looked like. She weaponized my natural professional detachment, making it sound like clinical, unfeeling sociopathy. Her attorney stepped up to the podium to cement the narrative. He was a master of the backhanded compliment. He openly acknowledged that I was an exceptionally gifted financial investigator. He praised my intellect for the court record, but, he argued, brilliant minds are often the most fragile. He stated that my specific skill set, hunting corporate fraud, anticipating deception, and tearing apart complex financial structures, was exactly what made me so incredibly dangerous to myself and my family after experiencing a massive trauma. He argued that I had taken the profound, messy grief of losing a parent and forced it into the only framework I understood, a criminal investigation. To validate this damaging theory, he called Dr. Alan Wexler to the stand. The psychiatrist wore a tailored tweed jacket and spoke with a soft, authoritative academic cadence that immediately put the gallery at ease. Wexler testified that, based on his extensive review of my communications, I exhibited a textbook inability to compartmentalize. He claimed my grief had rapidly metastasized into severe paranoia. He told the judge that I had a distinct, documented tendency to view every minor domestic deviation as a grand, malicious conspiracy. According to his expert medical opinion, I had completely lost the vital cognitive ability to distinguish between the cynical suspicions required for my profession and the mundane reality of my own grieving family. The fatal blow of their presentation came when her lawyer introduced an audio exhibit. He pressed a key on his laptop, and my own voice suddenly echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom. It was a voicemail I had left for my father late one evening, several months before he passed away. In the recording, I sounded completely unhinged. I was out of breath, my voice tight, ragged, and frantic. I was aggressively complaining about missing ledger entries and a series of highly disorganized bank statements. I heard myself saying that nothing was making sense, that someone was actively hiding things from me, and that I felt like I was completely losing my mind trying to track the numbers. The recording was entirely stripped of its context. It was originally a frustrated rant about a highly complex, disorganized corporate client I was investigating at my firm. But played here, in this quiet room, immediately following the clinical diagnosis from Wexler, it sounded exactly like a woman actively suffering a paranoid psychological breakdown regarding her own family estate. The physical shift in the courtroom was immediate and devastating. The heavy wooden benches in the gallery creaked loudly as the spectators collectively leaned toward Diane's side of the aisle. I heard harsh, judgmental whispers rippling through the rows behind me. I looked at Evan. My younger brother had dropped his chin completely to his chest, unable to even look in my direction. He looked utterly crushed, thoroughly convinced that his sister was broken beyond repair. Diane seized the moment flawlessly. She pulled a crisp white tissue from her purse and gently dabbed the corner of her eye, whispering audibly to her attorney about how deeply it broke her heart to do this to the stepdaughter she had always tried to treat as her own flesh and blood. The judge turned his attention to the defense table. The look in his eyes was heavy with professional pity. He expected me to stand up and shout. He expected a tearful, desperate denial, or perhaps another frantic, paranoid outburst that would perfectly validate the psychiatric evaluation he had just heard. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my dark gray suit. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity. I did not immediately launch into a wild accusation about her secret lover or the hidden luxury apartment. The time for the killing blow had not yet arrived. I needed to systematically dismantle the foundation of their trap first. I looked directly at the judge and stated that I wished to cross-examine the plaintiff's expert witness. Dr. Wexler returned to the stand, looking slightly annoyed by the inconvenience. I walked out from behind the defense table, holding nothing but a single thin legal pad. I kept my posture perfectly rigid and my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Dr. Wexler," I began, my tone as flat and clinical as a steel scalpel. "Could you please state for the court exactly how many total hours you and I have spent sitting in the same room for a formal psychiatric evaluation?" Wexler shifted his weight in the heavy oak chair. "We have not conducted a traditional, in-person clinical interview. As I stated in my detailed report, my evaluation was a forensic psychological profile based on prior behavioral evidence." 0 hours, I interrupted smoothly, entirely ignoring his attempt to pivot. "Thank you. And could you please tell the court exactly how many pages of my personal, private medical history you subpoenaed or reviewed from my actual primary care physician before declaring me mentally incompetent today?" The courtroom grew remarkably quiet. The soft hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed very loud. Wexler gripped the wooden armrests of his chair tightly. "I relied heavily on the behavioral evidence provided by your family members, which is standard practice in emergency guardianship situations where the subject is uncooperative." 0 pages, I stated, cutting him off a second time. I took one deliberate step closer to the witness stand. "Is it not entirely accurate, Doctor, that 95% of the audio recordings, emails, and behavioral anecdotes you used to build your damning psychological profile were hand-delivered to you directly by Diane Rivera, the exact same woman who stands to gain total, unchecked control over a multi-million-dollar estate if I am locked out of the trust?" "Objection," Diane's lawyer barked, jumping to his feet so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Counsel is aggressively badgering the witness and making argumentative, baseless assumptions." "Sustained," the judge said, though his eyes were now fixed sharply on the psychiatrist rather than me. "Rephrase your question." "I will withdraw the question," I said softly. Turning my back on Wexler, I had achieved exactly what I needed. I had not destroyed the doctor completely, but I had successfully stripped away the impenetrable halo of objective science that Diane had desperately tried to wrap around him. He no longer looked like an impartial, flawless medical authority. He looked exactly like a highly paid consultant reciting a carefully curated script written by my stepmother. I walked back to my desk and placed my hand firmly on the massive, heavy evidence binder resting in front of the court clerk. The room was holding its collective breath. I did not look at Evan. I did not look at Diane. I looked only at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice dropping to a low, incredibly calm register that forced everyone in the room to lean forward just to hear me clearly. "The plaintiff has submitted a highly specific document to justify this entire emergency proceeding. I am referring to the internal memorandum, allegedly signed by my late father, granting my stepmother immediate operational control over the trust funds." I paused, letting the silence stretch and tighten like a physical wire across the room. I asked the clerk to formally open the third section of my defense exhibits. The thick metallic sound of the heavy binder rings snapping open echoed like a gunshot. "I am not going to argue about my emotional state today," I continued, staring unblinkingly at the man on the bench. because my emotional state is entirely irrelevant to the law. If the document submitted by the plaintiff is real, I will surrender my position as trustee right now. I will walk out of those heavy wooden doors, and I will gladly lose today. I finally turned my head, locking my eyes entirely onto Diane's suddenly pale, rigid face. "But," I said, the cold, absolute certainty in my voice freezing the air in the room, "if the forensic evidence proves that this document is a complete forgery, then this entire hearing is no longer a tragic story about protecting a grieving family. It is a hostile, calculated corporate takeover, built entirely on fabricated paperwork." I directed the court clerk to open the heavy blue section of my evidence binder and pull the document labeled Exhibit D. It was the formal report from the independent forensic document examiner. I turned my attention directly to the judge, keeping my voice incredibly level and precise. I did not need to shout. The sheer weight of the facts was loud enough. I explained to the court the fundamental difference between a genuine ink signature and a digital forgery. I noted that when my father signed a legal document, his heavy pen strokes always left a distinct, physical depression in the paper fibers. The ink would pool at the stopping points. However, the signature on the internal memorandum Diane had submitted as her ultimate trump card contained absolutely zero physical texture. It was a completely flat cluster of pixels. It was a digital image perfectly superimposed onto a blank canvas. Before her attorney could even stand up to form a coherent objection, I immediately directed the clerk to the next page. It contained the extraction logs from the digital forensic analyst. I explained what metadata was, describing it as the invisible, undeniable digital fingerprint permanently embedded inside every electronic file. I read the exact creation timestamp into the official court record. The source file for the document granting my stepmother emergency control of the company funds was not created while my father was alive. The file was generated exactly 17 days after my father passed away. Furthermore, the routing data proved that the specific device used to construct the forgery was the exact same computer that had been routinely transmitting emails back and forth with the office of Diane's own legal counsel. Her lawyer practically leaped out of his expensive leather chair. He slammed his hand on his table, his face turning a dark shade of crimson. He aggressively objected, shouting about unverified discovery, procedural ambushes, and wildly inappropriate legal conduct. He was sweating profusely, desperately trying to throw a blanket over the fire. But the judge simply stared at him coldly, raised his hand to demand silence, and firmly overruled the objection. The judge ordered me to continue. The trap was rapidly closing. I did not give them a single second to catch their breath. I immediately moved to the red section of the binder. It was time to expose the financial architecture of her treason. I systematically laid out the massive web of wire transfers draining the operational funds of Rivera Urban Transit Group. I recited the specific amounts out loud. I spoke of transactions for $8,500, $9,200, and $7,900. I demonstrated how dozens of these small, calculated payments were routed directly into the accounts of the 3 newly minted shell companies. Then, I connected the most damning chronological thread. I presented a confidential email log showing exactly when Diane had secretly discovered the contents of my father's amended will. She had learned, months before his death, that he was stripping her of her primary financial authority and placing the core trust entirely under my control. I matched the date of her discovery with the state incorporation records. Exactly 48 hours after she realized she was going to lose the keys to the kingdom, the 3 shell companies were officially registered. She had begun preparing to steal his legacy the very moment she realized she could no longer legitimately control it. Her attorney tried to interject again, arguing weakly that there was absolutely no physical evidence connecting his client to those abstract corporate entities. That was the exact moment I introduced the visual proof. I asked the clerk to display the high-resolution security photographs obtained from the private wealth management bank. The images were undeniable. They clearly showed Diane sitting in the bank lobby, completely lucid and deeply engaged in signing the deposit slips for the master investment account where all the stolen corporate money was being heavily consolidated. I followed the photographs with the technical network logs. I proved that the Internet Protocol addresses used to digitally authorize the fraudulent wire transfers belonged directly to the private wireless router located inside Diane's own home. She was not a passive beneficiary. She was the active, operating architect of the theft. I waited for the shocked murmurs in the gallery to reach a chaotic peak before I dropped the first massive anchor. I formally announced the name of the man sitting next to her in the bank photographs. It was Russell Dane. I turned slightly, ensuring my voice carried to the rows of extended family members sitting behind the wooden partition. I reminded them of her exact words from the funeral. She had sworn to everyone that Russell was merely an old commercial contractor who used to fix the plumbing in my father's office buildings. But the signed documents resting on the judge's desk proved he was her intimate partner in a highly orchestrated federal embezzlement scheme. The second surprise I delivered was designed to completely shatter any lingering illusion of her humanity. I did not just show that they were stealing money to buy an out-of-state luxury apartment. I wanted the court to see exactly how deeply she had betrayed her dying husband. I produced a certified bank requisition form drawn directly from the stolen funds. I explained that a massive withdrawal of $55,000 had been wired directly to an elite, private boarding school located on the opposite side of the country. The payment had absolutely nothing to do with corporate business, and it certainly had nothing to do with my father's expensive medical care. That stolen money was used to pay the annual tuition for Russell Dane's teenage son, while my father was lying in a hospital bed, fighting agonizingly for every single breath. Diane was actively using his life's work to finance a brand-new, secret family she was building behind his back. The perfectly manicured rhythm of Diane's performance collapsed entirely. She lost her breath. Her hands, which had been dabbing delicate, manufactured tears just 20 minutes ago, were now gripping the edge of the heavy wooden defense table so fiercely that her arms were violently shaking. She stared at the binder as if it were a venomous snake. I looked past her and saw Evan. My younger brother snapped his head up so fast it looked painful. He stared directly at his mother. The profound devastation written across his young face was absolute and completely heart-wrenching. He looked at her as if she were suddenly speaking a terrifying, demonic language he could not comprehend. Everything she had whispered to him in the dark, every vicious lie she had fed him about my sanity, every document she had convinced him was real, it all incinerated right in front of his eyes. The entire courtroom fell into a suffocating, paralyzed silence. The judge, the bailiff, the court reporter, and the gallery finally understood the terrifying reality of the situation. This was no longer a tragic, emotional dispute over an inheritance. This was a highly sophisticated, multi-layered criminal enterprise. My reputation, my career, and my very sanity were simply the first structural columns she had decided to ruthlessly demolish to clear her path, but I still had not played my final card. I closed the thick red binder, the heavy cover falling shut with a loud, final thud. I stopped my presentation right at the exact moment everyone in the room believed the truth could not possibly get any more horrific. I let the terrible weight of her betrayal settle over the quiet room. Then, I looked directly up at the judge. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper that demanded absolute attention. I stated that there was still one missing piece of the puzzle. I told the court that I had one final document to submit, a document that would explain exactly why Diane could not afford to wait. It would explain the terrifying, hidden reason why she had desperately rushed into this courtroom today, attempting to legally erase my mind before the end of the month. I reached into the final section of my briefcase and pulled out a certified, sealed envelope. I did not give the opposing counsel even a fraction of a second to recover from the shock of the boarding school revelation. I needed to keep the pressure absolute and unyielding. I handed the envelope to the court clerk and explained that while my stepmother had been incredibly meticulous about laundering the stolen cash through shell companies, she had made a fatal, arrogant mistake regarding her daily digital communications. She had assumed that because my father was deceased, his personal devices were completely irrelevant. She had forgotten about the automatic cloud synchronization protocols tied to their shared household cellular account. Operating under a strictly authorized digital subpoena, my independent forensic team had recovered a massive archive of deleted text messages that had mirrored onto my father's dormant cloud server. I asked the clerk to read the highlighted transcripts into the official record. The words echoed through the silent courtroom, utterly devastating in their casual cruelty. The first message was sent from Diane to Russell Dane late on a Tuesday night, exactly 3 weeks after my father's funeral. It read, "We need to push the guardianship paperwork through right now. You have to accelerate the timeline before she gets a chance to open all the corporate ledgers and see the outgoing transfers." The second message, sent 2 days later, was the undeniable blueprint of her entire malicious campaign. It read, "I am talking to the lawyers tomorrow. We just need to find a doctor who will put it on paper that she is completely unstable. If she looks crazy, nobody will ever look at the bank accounts." Her attorney leaped out of his chair as if the leather had suddenly caught fire. His face was slick with panic sweat. He slammed his fist on the table, shouting at the top of his lungs. He aggressively objected to the admission of the text messages, wildly claiming they were unauthenticated digital hearsay, illegally obtained, and entirely inadmissible due to severe procedural violations. He was trying to throw a massive wall of legal noise over the glaring truth. I did not flinch. I calmly reached back into my binder and pulled out a federal authentication certificate, complete with the sworn digital chain of custody from the cellular provider's compliance division. I slid the heavy cardstock across the table. I informed the court that the data was extracted under a lawful warrant executed by a licensed private investigation firm, verified by an independent cyber forensics laboratory, and formally notarized. The judge stared down at the screaming lawyer. The judge's expression was no longer neutral. It was carved from solid ice. He sharply ordered the attorney to sit down and remain completely silent, officially overruling the desperate objection. The lawyer collapsed into his chair, loosening his expensive silk tie, realizing his entire career was currently standing on a trapdoor. At that exact moment, the heavy, suffocating silence of the courtroom was violently broken by the sound of wood scraping against hardwood. Everyone turned to look at the gallery. Evan was standing up. My younger brother looked physically ill. All the color had drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His hands were trembling so violently, he had to grip the wooden back of the pew in front of him just to remain upright. The armed bailiff immediately stepped forward, resting his hand firmly on his heavy-duty belt, preparing to remove a disruptive spectator, but the judge raised a single, commanding hand, signaling the officer to stand down. The judge looked at the young man, sensing the profound psychological fracture happening in real time. "I signed it," Evan whispered. His voice cracked, sounding like a terrified, heartbroken child rather than a grown man. He took a shaky breath and spoke louder, staring directly at the judge. "I signed the papers. She came to my house late at night. She told me it was just standard family tax documents. She said it was routine household paperwork that needed a second signature to keep the estate from going into probate." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Evan turned his head slowly, looking down at his mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "I did not read them," Evan continued, his voice breaking into a suppressed sob. "I trusted her, but it was not a tax form. It was the sworn affidavit. I signed the document claiming my sister was having a mental breakdown. She made me sign the paper that helped build this entire case." His confession did not save me in a legal sense. My evidence had already done that. But his agonizing admission accomplished something far more terrifying. It completely obliterated the last remaining shred of Diane's humanity. It proved to the court, and to every single family member sitting in that room, that she had not just targeted her stepdaughter. She had weaponized her own biological child. She had blindly manipulated her own son, turning his signature into a loaded gun, actively using him as a human shield to fortify her fabricated story. She had been willing to destroy his relationship with his only remaining sister just to secure her stolen wealth. I watched Diane carefully. She refused to look at Evan. She kept her eyes glued firmly to the wooden table, her breathing shallow and rapid. She was a cornered predator, realizing the exits were entirely sealed. But I was not finished. The stolen money, the forged medical claims, the manipulation of my brother, all of it was just the surface machinery of her greed. It was time to expose the massive, devastating engine driving the entire plot. I picked up the final document from my desk. It was a thick, multi-page contract bound with a heavy metal clip. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the emotional wreckage of the room with absolute, clinical precision. The plaintiff did not file this emergency guardianship petition simply to hide the theft of a few $100,000. She filed this petition because of what she intended to do the very second she was granted temporary legal control over my father's estate. I submitted the final contract to the court clerk. I explained exactly what the document was. It was a fully drafted, heavily negotiated agreement for the quiet, off-market sale of the most valuable, core commercial asset in the Rivera Urban Transit Group portfolio. The buyer was a massive, aggressive private equity fund located out of state. The drafted purchase price was for tens of millions of dollars. I directed the court to look at the timestamp on the digital draft. The contract had been drawn up exactly 14 days before Diane officially filed the papers to have me declared mentally incompetent. The entire architectural design of her treason finally became visible to everyone in the room. If the judge had believed her lies today, if he had granted her the temporary financial guardianship she desperately sought, she would have possessed the absolute legal authority to sign that catastrophic contract. She would have instantly liquidated the crown jewel of my father's business empire. She would have locked me out of the corporate accounts, finalized the massive sale, wired the tens of millions of dollars to an offshore holding company, and completely vanished with Russell Dane long before any federal fraud investigation could even begin. She did not just want to keep the petty cash she had already stolen. She was actively preparing to carve up my father's entire lifelong legacy into bloody, liquid pieces and walk away over our ruined lives. I slowly placed my hands flat on the table. I stopped looking at my legal notes. I stopped looking at the judge. I turned my body entirely to the left, facing the plaintiff's table. For the first time in 10 agonizing months, I let the heavy iron vault inside my chest swing wide open. I let her see the cold, absolute fury I had been forced to bury since the day we put my father in the ground. "You did not bring me into this courtroom to protect this family," I said, my voice ringing out, sharp and terrifyingly clear. "You did not forge my father's signature and buy a fake psychiatric evaluation because you were worried about my grief." Diane finally looked up at me. Her face was completely hollow, her carefully constructed mask shattered into a million unfixable pieces. "You are not afraid that I have lost my mind," I told her, holding her gaze with a force that made her physically shrink back into her chair. "You are absolutely terrified because you know I am completely sane. And you knew that if I stayed awake, I would catch you." The entire courtroom felt like it was suspended over the edge of a massive, dark cliff. The silence was so absolute you could hear the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights buried in the ceiling. Then, the judge moved. He did not reach for his wooden gavel. He did not issue a verbal warning about courtroom decorum. He simply stopped looking at the paperwork. He slowly reached up with both hands and removed his gold-rimmed glasses, folding them with deliberate, agonizing slowness before placing them gently on his elevated desk. He picked up the original copy of the forged internal memorandum. He held the fake piece of paper between his fingers, looking down at the plaintiff's table with an expression of profound, chilling authority. The judge's voice dropped to a low, booming register that commanded the immediate obedience of every single soul in the room. He looked directly at my stepmother and issued a single, terrifying directive. "Mrs. Rivera," the judge said, "I strongly suggest you stand up right now." The judge stared down from the elevated bench. He did not look through his gold-rimmed lenses anymore. His eyes were bare, piercing, and terrifyingly human. The booming acoustics of the room seemed to absorb the heavy silence before he finally spoke. "Mrs. Rivera, the judge began, his tone entirely stripped of all judicial neutrality and replaced by a cold, cutting authority. I need you to clarify something for the official record right now. Do you actually want this court to believe you are desperately trying to save your family? Or do you simply need this court to legally cover up your own catastrophic criminal actions? Diane recoiled physically as if she had been struck. She desperately attempted to pull her shattered mask back into place. She widened her eyes, pressing her trembling hand to her chest in a pathetic pantomime of deep, wounded offense. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin one final web of sympathetic lies. But the judge was no longer watching a theatrical performance. He was actively reading a heavily documented crime scene. He ruthlessly laid out the intersecting timelines right in front of her face. He pointed a stern finger at the forged internal memorandum, then referenced the chronological ledger of illicit wire transfers, then quoted the verified text messages between her and Russell Dane, and finally held up the massive drafted contract for the commercial real estate sale. Every single avenue of retreat, every possible excuse, and every carefully constructed lie was systematically bricked up and permanently sealed shut by her own arrogant paper trail. Under that unbearable, suffocating pressure, the intricate machinery of her mind finally broke, the meticulously constructed image of the grieving widow completely incinerated. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the heavy oak defense table. Her face flushed a violent, dark shade of red, and she completely lost control of her carefully modulated voice. "I deserved far more than what he left me," she screamed, the bitter words echoing harshly against the wood-paneled walls of the courtroom. "Daniel owed me his entire life. I gave him my youth. I organized his miserable, exhausting existence. I dealt with his sickness when no one else would. You have absolutely no idea what I sacrificed to keep this ungrateful family functioning while she was off playing corporate spy." With those few, venomous sentences, the final illusion evaporated into the cold air. There was no longer a devoted wife burdened by sudden tragedy standing in that room. There was only an entitled, deeply arrogant woman who genuinely believed that her mere presence in our household granted her the divine right to rewrite legal ownership, to manipulate the absolute truth, and to destroy the honor and sanity of anyone who dared to stand in her way. The judge did not allow her to continue her tirade. He struck his wooden gavel with a force that sounded like a rifle shot. He immediately and entirely dismissed the emergency financial guardianship petition with extreme prejudice, but the hammer of justice did not stop falling there. He formally ordered the court clerk to transfer my entire physical binder of evidence, detailing the forged legal documents, the corporate embezzlement, and the highly organized multi-state federal fraud scheme, directly to the appropriate district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. He issued an emergency, binding order to freeze all connected bank accounts, immediately locking down the joint investment portfolio and the offshore routing numbers she had planned to use for her escape. He then turned his unforgiving gaze toward Diane's attorney. The lawyer was sweating profusely, his career flashing before his eyes. The judge explicitly ordered the man to prepare a separate, formal legal defense explaining his exact role in submitting a fabricated document to a court of law. Finally, the judge officially named Russell Dane on the public court record as an active co-conspirator in an ongoing criminal enterprise, ensuring that the authorities would be knocking on his door before the sun went down. Behind the wooden partition, Evan completely broke down. He did not cry with the gentle, quiet sorrow of a young man losing a mother. He wept with the violent, ragged, suffocating gasps of a man drowning under the weight of his own profound guilt. He realized in that agonizing moment that he had actively helped to destroy his only sister. His thoughtless signatures on those manipulated documents, driven by a deeply twisted sense of family loyalty and her constant whispering, had provided the foundational bricks for the psychological prison she tried to lock me inside. I did not celebrate. I did not pump my fist in the air, nor did I allow a triumphant, vindictive smile to cross my face. I did not even turn around to look at Diane as the armed bailiff stepped closer to her table to ensure she did not try to flee the room. I simply stood in complete, heavy silence, As the court clerk gathered the massive stacks of paper from the desk, for the first time in nearly one entire year, I took a deep, unobstructed breath. I felt the crushing physical weight of the past 10 months finally slide off my tired shoulders and crash against the hardwood floor. 2 hours after the court officially adjourned, I drove my car out to the quiet, green hills of the city cemetery. The late afternoon sun was casting long, peaceful shadows across the perfectly manicured grass. I stood silently before the dark granite stone bearing my father's name. I did not bring expensive bouquets of flowers. I brought only the truth. I spoke out loud to the empty, cool air. I told him that I was deeply, profoundly sorry that I could not save him from the absolute cruelty of that woman while he was still breathing. But I promised him, with every ounce of strength left in my body, that I had saved his name. I had protected the sprawling company he had bled to build from the dirt up, and I had successfully defended the absolute truth he left behind. In the long, difficult months that followed the trial, I aggressively restructured the Rivera Urban Transit Group. I implemented ironclad oversight protocols and removed every single executive who had blindly looked the other way. I took a significant portion of the recovered funds and established a massive, well-funded community development foundation named in honor of both my biological parents. Evan and I started the excruciatingly slow, incredibly delicate process of rebuilding our fractured relationship. We spent countless hours sitting in quiet coffee shops, navigating the heavy, complicated trauma of what we had survived, slowly learning how to trust each other again. But long after the grand jury criminal indictments were handed down, and long after the stolen millions were legally recovered and safely returned to the trust, a single, haunting thought remained firmly anchored in my mind. When a calculated predator spends years methodically isolating you, constantly whispering vicious lies into the dark, and actively conditioning every single person around you to doubt the fundamental stability of your own reality, the ultimate victory does not actually begin in a crowded courtroom. The very first, true triumph is not the brilliant, cinematic counterattack, nor is it the flawless presentation of undeniable forensic evidence. The first victory is simply finding the profound, terrifying courage to stand entirely alone in the dark and daring to believe exactly what you saw from the very beginning. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. Please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by even more people.